People think the worst betrayal comes from strangers, but it's the familiar knock on your own front porch that teaches you what real violation feels like. That's the moment everything shifted for me. The day I realized the house my sister left behind wasn't just being misused. It was being quietly siphoned away, one weekend rental at a time, by someone who once called himself family. I came back to the lake house expecting dust, silence, maybe a few faded memories waiting by the windows. Instead, I found footprints from strangers on the porch, the smell of detergent I didn't recognize, lights left on in rooms no one should have entered. At first I thought I was imagining it. Grief does that sometimes, bending the edges of what's real. But then I found the envelope of cash, the messages from guests, the lock logs that told a story far louder than any confession. This wasn't carelessness. It was a system, a pattern, a choice repeated behind my back. And the person doing it was someone my sister trusted. So this story isn't about anger. It isn't about revenge. It's about what happens when the truth arrives quietly, like a draft slipping under the door, cold, undeniable, and asking you what you're going to do about it. It's about the folder I built piece by piece. It's about the fines, the hearings, the silence, the consequences. It's about the moment balance became more important than forgiveness. If you've ever had to protect something that mattered, something someone thought they could take because they assumed you wouldn't fight back, then you'll understand every word of what follows. Stay with me. And if you want more stories like this, quiet, emotional, and true in the way life is true, make sure to subscribe to the channel. I arrived at the lake house just after dusk, the kind of dusk that slips in without color. The air inside was colder than I remembered, carrying that faint scent of damp wood that settles into a place left quiet too long. My sister used to open the windows every morning, even in winter, claiming the house breathed better than people did. I touched the curtain she'd tied in that small, perfect knot, her way of taming the world. It hadn't moved. The stillness pressed at my ribs. Coming back for her one-year memorial had taken everything out of me. Walking into this house felt like stepping into the echo of a voice I used to hear every day. I set my bag down and let the silence close again, familiar but heavier, as if the house had been waiting for me to notice something I hadn't yet seen. It didn't take long. On the kitchen counter, right where she used to leave grocery lists and holiday notes, sat a folder wrapped in a worn rubber band. The paper edges were slightly curled, like it had been handled in a hurry and then abandoned. I didn't open it at first. I just stood there, looking at it the way you look at a question you're not ready to answer. When I finally lifted the cover, I found the winter utility bill on top, numbers climbing higher than any cold season should justify. I read it twice. My sister kept meticulous records. Nothing here should have been out of line. Yet the digits rose like a quiet alarm. I slid the paper back in, feeling a thin line of suspicion thread under my skin. My phone buzzed before I could think much more about it. A message from Matt. "I've been checking on the place. Let a friend stay a few nights. Hope that's fine." His tone was casual, the way someone might talk about borrowing a sweater. I stared at the words, reading past the politeness into the assumption hiding underneath. He hadn't asked, he'd informed. A small detail, but small details are where truth usually slips through. I typed nothing back. Instead, I let the message sit on the screen like an open door he'd walked through without waiting to be invited. I'd been polite with him for a year. Grief makes people overly generous. But something in me shifted as I reread his line. This house wasn't his to manage. I set the phone down and took a slow breath, steadying myself the way my sister taught me when paperwork used to overwhelm me. Document first, react second. I lifted the bill again, noting the timestamp, the meter reading, the comparison to last year. I photographed both sides and saved them into a folder named House Winter. My hands moved with a calm I didn't entirely feel, but the routine gave me shape. The porch light filtered in through the window, a steady yellow glow brushing the edge of the counter, pulling focus to the smallest details. The smudge on the envelope, the faint crease on the corner. It was almost as if the light wanted me to keep watching, to keep collecting. The house should have been still, but the moment I stepped into the living room, I caught a smell that didn't belong. Fresh laundry detergent, bright and floral, the kind sold in bulk at discount stores. My sister hated strong fragrances. She used unscented everything. I followed the trail to the throw blanket draped across the couch. It was slightly damp, as if washed recently and hurried back into place. Someone had been here more than a few nights, and they hadn't cared enough to hide it. I stood there, my hand hovering above the fabric, the room suddenly feeling smaller, warmer, intruded upon. A different kind of ache rose in me. Not grief this time, but a quiet, controlled anger. Then my phone vibrated again, 3 times, sharp and close together, before falling silent. I didn't have to look to know who it was. Matt rarely called, but he always reached out when he sensed something slipping out of his control. The house hummed around me, the refrigerator clicking on, the porch light holding steady against the dark. I let the vibrations fade without answering. The bill, the message, the unfamiliar detergent. None of it was dramatic, but all of it was loud enough. I stood in the center of my sister's living room, the damp blanket still carrying someone else's scent, and understood this wasn't just a visit home. It was the beginning of a line someone else had crossed, and I was finally seeing the shape of it. The next morning, after a night of light sleep and heavier thoughts, I opened my laptop at the kitchen table. The house looked different in early daylight. Clean lines, soft dust on the mantel. The quiet stubbornness of a place that had learned how to keep its own counsel. Out of habit, I typed the address into a search bar. There was no reason to expect anything. It was simply a way of confirming the world hadn't shifted overnight. But the moment the Airbnb page loaded and the house appeared with a glowing blue pin, I felt a cold wave travel down my spine. There it was, a full listing. Lake Retreat, entire home. The words were polite and inviting, the kind of phrasing my sister would have hated. I clicked the page, each photo appearing like a version of my own memory, but altered. Someone else's angle, someone else's control. The cover photo stopped me the longest. It was the porch, lit from an angle that made the railings appear warmer than they ever looked in person. But it was my sister's shot. I recognized it immediately. The way she framed the corner post, the faint blur of her thumb at the lower edge. She must have taken it on that old digital camera she never upgraded, insisting newer tech didn't understand natural light. Seeing her photo in this context felt like overhearing her laugh in a room where she shouldn't exist. I scrolled slowly, absorbing the staged blankets, the caption promising quiet mornings and easy living. There was nothing quiet about this. Nothing easy either. My sister's image had been turned into a sales pitch without consent. I forced myself to breathe evenly and checked the timestamp on the listing. Updated recently. Too recently. I took a screenshot, saving it into the same folder as the utility bill, labeling it with the exact minute, 8:37 p.m. The routine steadied me. Each documented piece became a step across a fragile bridge I didn't know I'd started building. Under my calm ran something sharper, disbelief touched with a thin burn of betrayal. I wasn't angry yet, anger would require more certainty, but I knew this, whatever Matt had been doing in the shadows of this house, he hadn't planned for me to see it, and he certainly hadn't planned for me to be methodical.
Another message from him flashed across my screen. "Don't worry, I know the rules." A smiling emoji followed, the kind meant to soften something that shouldn't be softened. It was the confidence in his tone that unsettled me most, as if the rules were his to interpret, as if the house were a suggestion, not a legacy. I stared at the message until the glow of it dimmed from my eyes. My sister used to say charm was just misdirection dressed nicely. I closed the notification without replying. The listing flickered on the screen like a truth he hadn't bothered to hide well enough. Or maybe he believed I'd never look. I closed the laptop, letting the room regain its natural light. The folder lay where I'd left it, the rubber band slightly stretched from years of use. I traced the edge of the cardboard with my thumb, as though the texture might offer clarity. It didn't, but it kept me anchored while my mind rearranged the pieces. The inflated bill, the damp blanket, the unfamiliar detergent, the listing that shouldn't exist. The house felt suddenly crowded with echoes, my sister's laugh, her warnings, her quiet way of insisting on order. I stood still for a long moment, letting the weight settle in my chest, steady but undeniable. Outside, the porch light blinked twice, then again,
A soft tremor of electricity brushing across the window. It wasn't unusual for old wiring to flicker, but it felt oddly timed, like the house exhaling in a language I half remembered. I looked back at the closed laptop, knowing I wasn't done, not even close. Whatever story Matt thought he'd written here was only beginning to reveal itself to me. The house wasn't mine by blood, but by promise, and promise carried more weight than paperwork. I reached for the folder again, not because I wanted to, but because I finally understood I didn't have the luxury of looking away. The email arrived just after sunrise when the house was still holding the last traces of night chill. The subject line was blunt: possible short-term rental violation. I opened it slowly, letting my eyes adjust to the crisp edges of the language. Article numbers, subsections, enforcement clauses. Regulations written without emotion somehow carried more force than any raised voice. I read each line as if they were instructions for dismantling a bomb. My sister had respected structure. She believed clarity was its own form of kindness. As I scrolled, the room felt smaller, the wooden beams pressing in with a quiet demand for truth. I clicked the PDF attached, scanning the notice twice before leaning back in the chair and letting the air settle. The accusation wasn't a surprise. The timing was. It meant someone else had seen what I'd seen. And someone had been watching long before I arrived. My phone lit up again. Matt. His message came fast, almost rehearsed. "Did you contact HOA? I didn't do anything wrong." The defensiveness in his tone was too quick, too sharp for someone confident in their innocence. I answered with a single screenshot. Section 7.3, the clause prohibiting short-term rentals without exception. No explanation, no commentary. Facts had a way of speaking more cleanly than people did. I watched the dots pulse as he typed, then vanish without sending. Outside, a bird landed on the railing, tapping its feet like it was waiting for a verdict. I put the phone face down. Replying wasn't necessary. The truth was already in motion. In the quiet afterward, I checked the mailbox tab I kept for administrative mail, a habit my sister and I shared. I saw her name next to mine on old subscription notices. The two of us lined up like parallel tracks that once ran in the same direction. The sight pulled something tender from under my ribs. Protecting this house had never been about ownership. It was about the imprint she left on every corner, every choice, every quiet morning we'd spent here. I wasn't defending a property line. I was safeguarding a memory with walls. The HOA notice wasn't an attack. It was a confirmation. Something had crossed a boundary she had trusted us to keep intact. I printed the email, letting the warm paper slide into my hands. Each sheet landed with a soft thud on the counter, Order layered on order, the weight of proof forming itself one page at a time. I slid the notice into the folder, aligning the edges until the stack sat square. There was comfort in precision. My sister had believed messes were easier to face when they were named, dated, and placed where they belonged. I pressed the folder shut lightly, listening to the faint rustle inside. Evidence didn't shout. It whispered. Persistent, patient, impossible to unhear. Standing there, I realized silence could be its own form of complicity. If I pretended not to notice the rentals, the bill spikes, the listing, then I was no different from anyone who let small wrongs blur into accepted routine. That wasn't who my sister raised me to be. I inhaled slowly, letting the cold morning air fill my lungs, clearing the small tremor I hadn't noticed until then. The house watched me, still and expectant. Responsibility shifts quietly, rarely with ceremony, more often with moments like this, when the path forward becomes obvious, even if unwelcome. A new notification chimed on my laptop, sharp, metallic, almost surgical. Another email, another step. The sound sliced through the room with a clarity that left no room for indecision. I reached for the mouse, steadying my breathing, letting the noise settle inside me instead of pushing against it. Whatever sat behind that notification, I knew it was tethered to the same unraveling thread. The house stayed quiet, the porch light still faint against the morning. I clicked, ready this time. Not for confrontation, but for acknowledgement. Some truths don't wait for permission to arrive. By evening, the house had settled into that quiet rhythm it kept after sunset. Soft ticking from the baseboard heater, distant creaks in the rafters, the lake wind brushing along the siding like a steady exhale. I sat at the dining table with the laptop open, arranging each screenshot and document in a clean sequence. Bills, photos, timestamps, the HOA notice. It was almost mechanical, the way my hands moved, but it brought a steadiness I needed. My sister used to call this resetting the room, letting order clear the emotional fog. I saved the files into a new folder on my drive, labeling them by date and hour. When I glanced at the clock, it read 8:12 p.m., an unremarkable time, but something in the stillness made it feel like a hinge in the night. I clicked the final save, hearing the faint hum of the dishwasher complete its cycle behind me. The phone vibrated against the table, sharp enough to echo through the wooden surface. Matt's name flashed on the screen. I let it ring once before answering, bracing myself. His voice came through too light, too casual, the kind of tone people use when they want to pretend things are simple. "So," he said, "how much do you want to settle this? 50-50? We both know rentals bring in good money." He laughed under his breath, a soft, confident sound that didn't match the words. I felt the muscles in my jaw tighten, though my tone stayed even. I had expected excuses, maybe an apology, but not an attempt to negotiate something he had no right to begin. I kept my voice steady. "I want compliance," I said, each word slow enough to land without force, but not without weight. Nothing more. There was a silence on the other end, not long, but long enough to reveal the crack beneath his confidence. I imagined him standing in some dim hallway, hand on his hip, calculating. The line stayed open, faint static brushing between us. I waited. He finally exhaled, a short, clipped breath. "You're overreacting," he muttered, though it sounded more like he was trying to convince himself. I didn't argue. Facts didn't require volume. Before I could say anything else, the call ended abruptly. A minute later, I refreshed the Airbnb listing, out of instinct. The page shifted. Availability closed, photos locked. The listing moved into private mode. It was a retreat disguised as maintenance. The digital version of slamming a door without admitting you'd done it. I sat back, letting the clarity settle. He wasn't stopping because he understood. He was stopping because he'd been seen. The distinction mattered more than he realized. Outside, the night thickened, carrying the faint scent of pine and something colder, sharper. A warning wrapped in clean air. I closed the browser and stood, stretching the stiffness from my shoulders. The window above the sink was cracked open, letting in a thin draft. When I pulled it shut, the glass trembled slightly in the frame, as if the house were reacting to the tension in the air. I paused, noticing again that faint trace of the detergent, the unfamiliar floral tone drifting from the living room. It lingered, like the memory of someone leaving in a hurry. I pressed my palm against the cool countertop, grounding myself. The house was no longer just a place I visited. It had become a ledger of truths waiting to be acknowledged. The porch light flickered once, then settled into darkness the exact moment the call log disappeared from the screen. I stood there for a long second, not reading into it, just letting the timing register. Some nights clarify themselves without explanation. I powered off the laptop, the screen dimming until the room returned to its natural shadows. The quiet wasn't peaceful, but it was honest. I could live with honest. I turned toward the hallway, feeling the house breathe around me, steady but alert, as if recognizing that something important had just shifted. The call came mid-morning, just as I was wiping down the kitchen counter, trying to reclaim the space inch by inch, a number I didn't recognize. I answered out of habit, expecting a delivery confirmation or a telemarketer. Instead, a strained voice came through, sharp and frustrated. "Hi, I'm at the house, and the code you sent isn't working. The lock won't open." For a moment, I didn't react. My brain searched for context that didn't exist. "Which house?" I asked, though I already knew. He repeated the address, the lake house, spoken like he'd rehearsed it. Behind him, I could hear the wheel of a suitcase rolling over gravel, the uneven rhythm betraying impatience. I closed my eyes, letting the realization land with a blunt, heavy certainty. Someone had been booked to stay here, recently, and they believed this was their confirmed reservation. I told him calmly to wait by the gate. I needed to see the situation with my own eyes. I drove the short distance with my hands steady on the wheel, though a tightness formed behind my ribs. When I stepped out, the air was cold enough to sting. A man in a denim jacket stood near the porch steps, rubbing his hands together, a suitcase propped beside him. Water spots dotted the wooden boards, fresh footprints leading up to the door. "I've been here 20 minutes, he said, as if I were the one responsible for his inconvenience. I scanned the porch, noting the slight muddiness at the edge, the faint drag mark of something heavy being pulled earlier. Whoever stayed before him had left in haste. The blanket on the couch, the detergent, the inflated bill, they formed a clean pattern now. A pattern Matt hadn't bothered to conceal. Before speaking to the guest again, I checked the mailbox out of instinct. A single envelope lay inside, unsealed, the handwriting uneven, rushed. Payment, cash. The words bled slightly where moisture had touched them, as if even the ink wanted to retreat from the implication. I slid the envelope open enough to see bills, crumpled, inconsistent denominations, the kind left after hurried exchanges. It wasn't a misunderstanding. It wasn't a favor for a friend. It was business. Run under the table, inside a house that wasn't his to use. My hand tightened around the envelope. I felt the same coldness I'd felt reading the HOA notice, clarity disguised as disappointment. I walked back toward the guest and explained, with a tone firm but not unkind. that the property was under compliance review and could not be rented. He looked disgruntled but resigned. Inconvenience hits differently when you're not the one paying a fine. I offered him the number to contact Airbnb support and waited until he left, suitcase wheels scraping against the gravel in retreat. Once the driveway cleared, I returned to the porch and took photographs. The envelope, the footprints, the doorframe, the timestamp on my phone. Each image slid into the folder on my device, forming a chain of events too coherent to ignore. Evidence wasn't dramatic, it was methodical. When the porch finally emptied of noise, I sat on the top step and looked out across the trees, bare branches swaying lightly in the wind. If she were here, I whispered, she'd know exactly what to do. My sister had always been better at balancing firmness with grace. I was learning it now, slowly, through necessity rather than talent. I closed my eyes, the scent of that unfamiliar detergent still faint in the air, a lingering reminder of how deeply someone had trespassed into a space she cherished. The ache in my chest was no longer raw grief. It had shifted, becoming something steadier, more resolute. Before going back inside, I knelt by the lock and listened to the quiet click of metal settling into place. It was a small sound, muted but certain, the kind a house makes when it acknowledges being protected. I stood, brushing off my hands, and felt the weight of responsibility settle in a way that didn't crush, but clarified. The line had been crossed fully now. There was no pretending otherwise. I stepped into the house, letting the door shut behind me with a measured finality. Whatever came next, I knew I was no longer reacting. I was moving with intention. That afternoon, the house felt unusually bright, sunlight slanting through the high windows and revealing every dust mote suspended in the still air. I set my laptop on the dining table and gathered all the documents I had accumulated. The inflated utility bill, the screenshots of the listing, the HOA notice, the envelope marked payment, cash, and the photos of the guests' footprints drying on the porch. One by one I printed them. The hiss and pull of the printer filled the room with a low mechanical steadiness, a kind of quiet metronome for the work ahead. The pages curled slightly at the edges as they cooled, each sheet holding another piece of a story Matt hadn't expected anyone to trace. I aligned them in neat stacks, feeling the same calm precision my sister once brought to tax season or home repairs. Tasks she approached with respect, never fear. Order gave shape to truth. When I reached for the folder, the rubber band slipped a little, stretched to its final days. I replaced it with a firmer clip, the metal snapping shut with a clean, decisive sound. The folder felt heavier now, not just in weight, but in meaning. No longer a loose collection of suspicions, but the emerging outline of something undeniable. I slid the printed pages inside, smoothing them flat. The house creaked gently, as if settling in response to the shift. I remembered how my sister used to say that clarity didn't always arrive kindly, but it always arrived. I closed the folder and rested my hand on top of it for a moment, letting the stillness settle around me like a protective layer. I opened a fresh notebook, one I kept for annual maintenance logs, and wrote out labels in steady handwriting. Utilities, photos, communication, compliance, timeline. Each word became a stepping stone, a way of turning scattered details into a structured narrative that would stand on its own. I slipped corresponding pages behind each divider. There was no anger in the process, just intention. Facts didn't need emotion to be powerful. They only needed to be arranged where they could be seen clearly. I dated the cover page, underlining the day with a firm stroke. For the first time since arriving, I felt my breath deepen, my spine straighten. The work gave me a sense of forward motion. I moved to the kitchen counter to tape labeled envelopes, one for receipts, one for printed screenshots, one for correspondence logs. The adhesive made a soft tearing sound each time it separated from the roll. I filed everything with deliberate care, sliding each sheet in as if the house itself needed proof that someone was finally paying attention. When I finished, I stepped back and looked at the arrangement. It resembled the beginning of a case file, though this wasn't a courtroom and I wasn't seeking punishment. I wanted transparency, accountability, the kind of fairness my sister lived by without ever naming it, the kind that didn't need applause to be real. Outside, the light shifted, turning the living room floor from pale gold to muted gray. I walked to the window and watched a thin breeze ripple across the tall grass. The property was quiet again, almost too quiet, as if waiting. I felt the weight of the past few days settle lower, transforming from tension into clarity. The folder now held the truth in chronological order. The evidence had found its spine. I knew there was more ahead, conversations, decisions, consequences. But preparing the documentation steadied me in a way emotion never could. The house no longer felt invaded. It felt defended. I returned to the table, gathered the envelopes, and slid everything neatly into the folder. When I clipped it shut, the final click echoed through the open space with a small, definitive finality. Evening approached, casting longer shadows across the wooden floor. The printer cooled, the house quieted, and I felt an unmistakable sense of readiness settle in. What had started as discomfort had become clarity, and clarity had become direction. I turned off the lights one by one, letting the house fall into a gentle hush. Tomorrow I would take the next step. Tonight, the work stood on its own. Dinner at my mother's house felt different now, quieter than it used to be. The table was set neatly, the same dishes we'd used since childhood arranged with nostalgic symmetry. My sister's absence had carved a hollow into these gatherings, one we all stepped around without naming. I sat across from my mother as she ladled soup into my bowl, her movements careful, almost ceremonial. She watched me with that blend of concern and restraint she used when she sensed I was holding something back. I hadn't planned on telling her anything yet, but silence has its own way of pressing at the seams. She asked about the lake house, simple, casual, but the words felt heavier than she intended. I stirred the soup, debating how much truth she deserved tonight. Her eyes narrowed slightly when I mentioned the unauthorized guests and the inflated bill. She set her spoon down with a soft clink that cut through the quiet. "Don't make this bigger than it needs to be," she said gently, though her tone carried an unspoken plea. "Family is family, and Matt, he's been through a lot too." I looked at her carefully, noting the way she avoided my gaze when she said his name. My mother had always been the peacekeeper in this family, smoothing rough edges with soft words. But peace built on avoidance wasn't peace, it was erosion. I didn't interrupt her, but something inside me tightened with a quiet, steady resolve. I placed my spoon beside my bowl, letting the soft ring of metal against porcelain settle between us. "If I stay quiet," I said slowly, choosing each word with care, "everything he's doing will become normal. And once it's normal, it won't stop." My voice didn't rise, but the truth in it filled the room. My mother blinked, her expression shifting from concern to something closer to fear. Fear not of conflict, but of the cost of facing it. She reached for her napkin, folding it and unfolding it, a nervous loop. I felt the air tighten around us as if the walls themselves were listening. She finally met my eyes, her voice softer, almost pleading. "You've lost so much already. I just don't want you to lose more." There was tenderness in her words and grief, and a quiet wish for things to be easier than they were. I leaned back slightly, grounding myself in the truth that had been building since I arrived at the lake house. "Doing nothing," I said, "is its own kind of loss." She didn't argue. She only looked down at her hands, the delicate tremor in her fingers betraying emotions she wouldn't voice. I felt an unexpected swell of empathy for her, caught between loyalty and fear, between memory and responsibility. After dinner, I stepped out onto her porch, needing a moment of air. The evening breeze carried the scent of damp leaves and the faint echo of neighborhood chatter. I closed my eyes and let the coolness steady me. My mother stayed inside, watching me from behind the living room curtain, her silhouette framed in the soft glow of the lamp. I knew she wanted to protect all of us, even when protection came at the cost of clarity. But some boundaries weren't hers to negotiate. They were mine, and the line had already been crossed. As I walked down the porch steps, the wind shifted, brushing the edge of my coat and stirring a memory of my sister standing in this very spot, hands in pockets, half smile on her face, watching the world with quiet certainty. That memory anchored me more than anything else could. I took a slow breath and headed toward my car, feeling the night settle around me in a way that was neither heavy nor comforting, just honest. The conversations ahead would be difficult, the decisions even harder. But I knew now that avoiding the truth wouldn't protect anyone. It never had. By Friday evening, the lake road was busier than usual. Cars humming past with weekend impatience, headlights sweeping briefly across the windows before disappearing into the curve. I stood in the living room, arms folded, watching the driveway through the narrow slit of the curtain. The first unfamiliar car rolled in just after 6, then another. I counted them quietly, each set of tires grinding over the gravel in the same careless rhythm. Their doors opened, laughter spilling out, cheerful, unbothered. The sound of people expecting a vacation, not a violation. I recorded everything from the window: arrival times, license plates, the number of bags. The house felt smaller with every new echo, as if its walls were absorbing the intrusion. I had hoped the previous confrontation would be a turning point. Instead, it seemed to mark the start of a pattern accelerating. The dragging sound of wheeled luggage on the porch steps pulled at my attention. I stepped back, giving myself distance, though the noise carried clearly inside. A woman tried the keypad, pressed a sequence, frowned, tried again. When the lock didn't open, she tapped her phone and started speaking in hurried tones. Another guest trying to solve a problem she didn't know was unsolvable. I filmed the interaction from behind the curtain, each detail a piece of the timeline. Their confusion wasn't personal, it was structural. They had been invited into a situation Matt had engineered, knowingly or not. I watched them circle the porch like orbiting satellites, unaware that the system they trusted had already failed. A message arrived from Matt mid-chaos. "Don't worry, just old friends dropping by for the weekend." The casual phrasing sat uncomfortably against the reality unfolding outside. I reread it, the contradiction sharpening my clarity instead of blurring it. Old friends didn't need lock codes. They didn't arrive with coolers, backpacks, and rental car stickers. I typed no response. Instead, I took another photograph, this time of the woman tugging her jacket tighter against the cold as she waited. The evening wind lifted her hair, carrying her impatience across the porch. She checked her watch, clearly frustrated. None of this belonged to me, but it was happening at my sister's door all the same. The sky shifted into a deeper blue, the kind that signals the end of sunlight rather than the beginning of night. I stepped onto the porch quietly once the guests wandered back toward their cars. My shoes pressed into damp wood, leaving faint impressions beside theirs. I checked the keypad myself, confirming the log entries written earlier. Everything was unchanged. Another sign that no one with authorization had altered a thing. I took a slow breath, feeling the cool air settle into my lungs. The house stood still beside me, its boards cold under my hand as I touched the railing. Nothing about this moment surprised me. It was simply confirmation of what I already understood. Inside, I added the evening's observations to the folder and clipped the new pages into place. The documentation grew, the narrative forming with quiet inevitability. I sat at the dining table, replaying the porch interactions in my mind. The laughter, the frustrated keypad attempts, the shifting impatience. Somewhere underneath the procedural rhythm, exhaustion began to curl at the edges. Not the kind caused by work, but the kind that comes from seeing too clearly. I pressed my fingers to my temples, just briefly, before refocusing. The house needed me to be precise, not weary. Outside, the porch light cast a soft line of gold across the entryway, sweeping over the damp wood where the guest had stood moments earlier. The glow stretched across the threshold, catching the edge of the welcome mat and the dark patch where a suitcase wheel had dragged. I paused at the window, watching the light shift with the faint movement of wind. It wasn't dramatic, just steady, watchful. I let the sight settle into me, grounding and quiet, a reminder that even in disruption, there were still small anchors of calm. Then I turned away, the folder under my arm, ready for whatever the next morning might bring. By Monday morning, the story had already begun to bend, reshaped not by truth, but by repetition. A mutual friend called while I was organizing receipts at the dining table. Her tone was hesitant, wrapped in the kind of caution people use when they fear choosing sides. "Matt says you're struggling," she began, the words slow, as if reading from a script. "He thinks you're not ready to let go of the house, that maybe this is about grief." I let her speak, listening without interruption. These weren't her thoughts. They were borrowed lines, passed along like secondhand clothing. Hearing them confirmed something I already suspected. Matt wasn't defending himself. He was rewriting the narrative. And he was doing it with confidence. After the call, I stepped into the hallway, needing the quiet. The house responded with its usual creaks, a kind of familiar acknowledgement. I checked the porch from the window. Everything was still. The damp from weekend footprints finally gone. My phone buzzed again. Another message forwarded from a different friend. "He says you're trying to control everything." The phrasing was sharp, designed to provoke. I slid the phone into my pocket instead of replying. Someone else's version of me didn't require a defense. What mattered was the version tethered to the facts, the one the folder represented. A small ache pressed against my chest. Not anger, not quite sadness. It was the dull weight that comes from realizing someone once considered part of the family had chosen deflection over accountability. I stood at the foot of the stairs looking at the framed photo of my sister smiling in the sunlight on the dock. Her hair was wind-tossed, her expression steady and warm. She had liked Matt. She believed he deserved the benefit of doubt. Maybe he did, once. But doubt only had room in the absence of evidence, and evidence filled every corner now. I touched the frame lightly, grounding myself in what hadn't changed. My responsibility to the home she trusted us with. A final message arrived mid-afternoon from someone I barely spoke to anymore. "He's having a tough time financially. Maybe cut him some slack?" The words weren't malicious, just uninformed. I sat on the edge of the couch, letting the information settle. Financial struggle explained choices. It didn't excuse them. And certainly not choices made with secrecy and entitlement. I thought about the guests, the cash envelope, the countless weekend intrusions. Nothing about any of it spoke of necessity. It spoke of convenience. I closed the message without answering. I returned to the dining table, adjusted the stack of papers, and breathed in deeply. The folder sat open, its contents arranged in precise order. Each page was a quiet rebuttal to every rumor circulating beyond these walls. I didn't need to counter Matt's words. The facts already did. A faint sadness threaded through me, though. Not for what he was saying, but for how far from the truth he'd chosen to drift. We were once a family that relied on candor. Now he was building an alternate version of events where I was the obstacle instead of the witness. I closed the folder gently, the soft thud grounding me in the present. Outside, the last light of day angled across the porch, leaving a slender band of brightness on the floorboards, a brief, fading line that reminded me of the clarity I still carried. I stood by the window, letting the quiet settle, and watched the light slowly disappear. There was no anger in me, just a sense of steady movement toward whatever came next. I wasn't chasing conflict. I was recognizing truth. And truth, once seen clearly, doesn't unsee itself. The official letter arrived on a Wednesday, folded neatly inside a cream envelope stamped with the HOA emblem. I found it in the mailbox just after noon, the paper still cool from the autumn air. I stood on the porch to read it, letting the natural light fall evenly across the page. The language was formal, deliberate. Cease and desist. Confirmed violations. Potential fine up to $25,000. Each sentence landed with the unmistakable authority of rules long established. I read it twice, not out of disbelief but out of a need for precision. The crisp edges of the letter fluttered slightly in the breeze, as if the air itself wanted to underscore the seriousness of what lay before me. The house behind me felt unusually silent, as though absorbing the weight of the words. Inside, I placed the letter on the dining table and opened the folder. The rubber band had stretched thin from use, its elasticity nearly gone. I slid it off and set it aside. The folder had grown thick, too thick for its original binding. I replaced it with a sturdier clasp, one with a firm metal grip. When it snapped shut, the sound was small but unmistakably final, the kind of click that marks a turning point. I aligned the new documents inside, smoothing the edges to sit flush. This wasn't just record-keeping anymore. It was the spine of a case, forming itself, piece by piece. I paused beside the window, letting the breeze cool the back of my neck. The house creaked softly, settling into its late afternoon rhythm. I thought of my sister again, how she approached every decision with quiet certainty, how rules weren't limitations to her, but guardrails that kept life from veering into chaos. I traced the grain of the wooden frame, remembering the promise I whispered to her months ago, long after the funeral crowds had drifted away. I'll take care of it. I felt the vow settle deeper into my chest. Caring for the house didn't mean sentiment. It meant honesty, even when honesty disrupted comfort. The letter needed acknowledgement and action. I took out my notebook and documented the delivery time, the date, the sender's details, and the exact phrasing of the notice. My handwriting stayed steady, each line an act of clarity. I printed the email thread that preceded the letter and attached it behind the physical copy. The organization wasn't compulsive. It was grounding. Every sheet placed where it belonged made the situation less abstract, more navigable. I knew there would be meetings, calls, perhaps arguments. But structure had always been my way of walking into uncertainty with a level head. As the sun dipped lower, I opened the sliding door and stepped onto the porch. The late day light stretched across the wooden boards, drawing long gold lines between the planks. I breathed in the cool air, steadying myself. This house had been a sanctuary once, a place for my sister to exhale, to read on rainy mornings, to repair the world in small ways. Now it felt like a hinge between past and present, holding pieces of both. I leaned against the railing, letting the scent of lake water and distant pine drift up toward me. The next steps wouldn't be easy, but they were necessary. When I came back inside, I slipped the compliance notice into the folder, pressing the clasp until it held firm. The pages inside rustled in quiet affirmation, as if acknowledging that the line between warning and consequence had finally been crossed. The room dimmed slightly as the last of daylight faded, and I reached for the light switch, illuminating the table with a warm, steady glow. I stood there a moment longer, hand resting on the folder, feeling its weight. Not as a burden, but as direction. Whatever happened next, I would meet it head-on, with the same precision my sister once lived by. The next morning began with an unexpected phone vibration, short, insistent, the kind that suggests someone wants something without saying it outright. A mutual acquaintance from the HOA board had texted. "Matt's been asking around. trying to get an exception under the tourism clause. I stared at the message, feeling a quiet shift inside me. Not surprise, not frustration, just the steady confirmation that he was widening the circle. I sat at the kitchen table, coffee cooling untouched beside me, and read the bylaws again. The tourism exemption didn't apply to residential zones. It never had. Yet he was testing every angle, hoping someone would mistake persistence for legitimacy. I set my mug aside, the ceramic touching the wood with a muted click, and opened my email to prepare the next step. I drafted a message to the HOA board, concise, factual, without embellishment. I attached the timeline, the photos, the lock logs, the cash envelope, the guest interactions, and the compliance notice. Then I added the relevant clause. No short-term rentals permitted under any seasonal exceptions. Before hitting send, I read it aloud in a low voice to check for steadiness. My sister liked clarity more than persuasion, so I followed that instinct. When I clicked send, the cursor flickered once before settling into stillness. The quiet afterward felt almost structural, as if the room itself paused to absorb the impact of that email entering the board's inbox. Later that afternoon, a discreet message arrived from a board member I trusted. It was brief. I understand. You're doing the right thing. Don't doubt it. The words were simple, but the validation threaded through me like a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. I leaned back against the chair, allowing the reassurance to settle deeper. The house creaked softly, responding to a shift in temperature or, perhaps, to the shift in me. After weeks of moving through a fog of half-truths and quiet violations, someone else finally spoke plainly. It made the burden feel less solitary. I printed the message, both for documentation and because holding the physical page felt grounding. The ink was still warm when I placed it in the folder. The stack inside had grown dense now, each page a layer of coherence that no narrative spin could undo. I remembered how my sister used to color-code her project binders in college, believing organization was a form of self-respect. I hadn't understood her then as clearly as I did now. This folder wasn't just evidence, it was a way of honoring the order she lived by. I pressed the clasp shut, listening to the quiet snick of metal touching metal. Evening settled in slowly, shadows stretching across the living room floor. I stepped outside for air, letting the cool breeze brush past my face. The neighborhood was quiet, the way it always was midweek. Dogs asleep, windows lit in soft amber, the distant hum of a radio drifting from a porch nearby. I wrapped my arms around myself, not from the cold, but from the weight of recognition. The situation had gained momentum, and I was no longer the only one who saw it clearly. I felt steadier than I had in days, my steps more anchored as I returned inside. Back in the kitchen, the folder sat where I'd left it, its edges squared, its contents aligned with a precision that no story could distort. I rested my hand on top of it for a moment, feeling its quiet authority. This wasn't about confrontation anymore. It was about alignment. Truth aligning with process aligning with consequence. The house around me stayed still, listening, acknowledging. I turned off the light, leaving the room in a calm, thoughtful dimness. Tomorrow, the next phase would begin. Tonight, the work spoke for itself. The mediation room was colder than I expected, bright lights, long shadows, and a round table that somehow made the space feel smaller. I arrived early, as I usually did, placing the folder neatly in front of me and aligning my pen parallel to the edge of the table. Outside, morning traffic hummed against the glass windows, a muted reminder that the world continued regardless of what happened in this room. I took a slow breath, steadying myself. This wasn't a courtroom. It wasn't even about winning. It was about clarity. When the mediator entered, she nodded politely, her expression neutral in the practiced way of someone trained to navigate tension without absorbing it. I greeted her with the same quiet professionalism. Then I waited. The door opened again and Matt stepped in. He offered a smile that didn't reach his eyes, a smile meant to disarm or redirect. "We're family," he said as he took his seat. "We don't need to make this dramatic." His voice aimed for casual, but there was a thin brittleness underneath. I looked at him without responding immediately, noting the way he adjusted his watch, how his foot tapped lightly against the chair leg. The room held a brittle stillness, like a photograph that hadn't decided if it wanted to fade or sharpen. I folded my hands and waited for him to continue. When the mediator asked for opening remarks, he leaned forward with practiced ease. "I think there's been a misunderstanding," he began. "I never meant to cause trouble. I was just trying to keep the place active. Guests weren't paying customers. They were friends helping out." I listened, letting each sentence settle. None of it matched the photos, the cash envelope, or the listing's booking logs. Still, I let him finish. When he trailed off, I spoke with the same calm I'd brought to every step of this process. "This is not about misunderstandings. It's about documented violations." The mediator glanced between us, her pen poised above a notepad, ready to capture the first fracture of truth. The mediator pressed a button on the recorder. A small red light blinked to life. The soft whir of the device filled the silence, marking the moment everything we said became part of the official record. I placed the folder on the table and opened it, sliding forward the key documents, the HOA policy, the guest photos, the listing screenshots, the time-stamped messages. I didn't speak to justify them. I simply presented them. Facts didn't require narrative. They required visibility. Matt leaned back, the color in his face shifting slightly, though he maintained the same thin smile. The mediator read quickly, absorbing details with a steady, practiced eye. As the review continued, time seemed to stretch and condense at once. My pulse was steady, not accelerated, each beat grounded by the cold air and structured format of the conversation. The mediator asked a few clarifying questions, her tone even, her posture composed. I answered each one, simply. Yes, no, documented, time-stamped. My sister's voice echoed faintly in my memory. Stay factual, not emotional. It anchored me more than anything else. The room grew quieter, the weight of the evidence settling like evening fog. Outside the window, sunlight shifted across the pavement, creating long, bright streaks that moved slowly across the floor. At the end of the session, I placed my keys gently on the table, hands steady, breathing even. The recorder clicked off with a soft mechanical sigh. The mediator closed her folder and stood, giving us both a measured nod before exiting the room. For a moment, the silence held. Then I rose, sliding my documents back into place with deliberate care. Matt stared at the floor, his foot no longer tapping. The room felt larger now, emptier, as though something had been pulled out from under the surface. I walked toward the door without looking back, each step quiet but firm, a closing gesture, not a confrontation. The email from the rental platform arrived late in the evening, long after the mediation session had already settled into the background noise of the day. The subject line was direct. All upcoming bookings canceled. I opened it slowly, letting my eyes move through the clean paragraphs explaining the policy enforcement. No listing could remain active under compliance review. The dates, neatly organized in a descending list, felt strangely stark. Bookings for weekends, holidays, short weekday retreats, all erased with a single administrative sweep. The room around me dimmed as the sun collapsed behind the trees outside. I sat back in my chair, the quiet enveloping me like a thin layer of dust. There was no satisfaction in seeing the cancellations, only a sense of something closing, a door returning to its proper position. A second email followed almost immediately, a guest requesting a refund. Host violated platform guidelines, I wrote. Nothing more, nothing less. The truth did not need embellishment. I sent the message and watched the screen brighten briefly before settling again. My reflection hovered faintly on the laptop surface, faint edges of my face almost merging with the darkened backdrop of the kitchen. This wasn't vindication, it was process. A necessary step in restoring the balance that had quietly skewed over time. As I shut the email tab, I felt the faintest echo of fatigue tug at the corners of my mind, though my hands remained steady. Night gathered more fully around the lake house, filling the spaces between furniture, pressing against the closed windows. I made a cup of tea, my sister's old evening ritual, and the steam rose in thin ribbons that curled toward the ceiling. As I lifted the mug, the soft scent brought a familiar ache. She used to sit by the window, her feet tucked beneath her, reading until the last streak of daylight vanished. Her memory drifted through the room like a quiet, steady warmth, contrasting sharply with the cold precision of the cancellations. I set the mug on the counter, tracing the faint ring left behind. The folder lay open on the dining table, its pages fanned slightly from earlier review. I added a printout of the cancellation notice, smoothing the edges before securing it behind the correspondence section. The sound of paper settling into place echoed faintly across the room. I checked the lock logs once more, confirming that no new entries had appeared since the mediation. Everything remained still, as if holding its breath. Outside, the wind brushed softly against the siding, a slow, steady rhythm that felt almost like reassurance. I closed the folder with a gentle, deliberate motion. I walked to the living room and lowered myself onto the couch, letting the cushions hold the subtle weight of the day. The air hummed with a quiet finality, not threatening, just present. My phone buzzed on the side table, but I didn't reach for it. Messages could wait. Explanations could wait. Even the next procedural step could wait until morning. For now, I allowed the stillness to settle, acknowledging the simple truth. Something had shifted, not in a triumphant way, but in a balanced, inevitable one. The house felt different, less burdened, more aligned. The nightly breeze moved through the gaps in the shutters, causing faint lines of light from outside to ripple across the floor. I watched them for a moment, breathing in the quiet. The porch remained empty, the driveway undisturbed, the walls holding steady. It felt like the house was resetting itself, reclaiming its boundaries, its pace, its identity. I lifted my tea again and took one slow sip. The warmth grounded me. This chapter wasn't over, but one part of the story had settled into place, cleanly and without noise. When I turned off the lamp, the darkness felt honest, not heavy. Morning light sliced through the kitchen blinds in thin, deliberate lines as I opened my laptop to prepare the formal report. The house was silent in a purposeful way, as if waiting for the next step to take shape. I laid out the documents in a precise sequence: the inflated utility bill, the screenshots, the guest encounters, the compliance notice, the booking cancellations. Each piece found its place on the table like an arrangement that had always been meant to be assembled. I began drafting the report, structuring it by date, event, and supporting evidence. The page filled slowly, not with emotion, but with clarity. Writing the report wasn't difficult, it was steadying. Every sentence sharpened the outline of what had occurred, reducing ambiguity and quieting any lingering doubts. When I reached the section asking for the desired outcome, I paused. My fingers hovered above the keyboard as I considered the line. I typed, "Seeking enforcement of existing regulations, not seeking damages." The simplicity of the statement felt right. I didn't want compensation. I wanted integrity reinstated where it had been eroded. I reread the sentence twice before moving on, ensuring it reflected my intent without excess. The cursor blinked, giving the impression of a quiet nod. I continued writing until every event had been captured with the same calm precision I had held since the first piece of evidence emerged. Once the draft was finished, I printed it and placed the pages side by side to review them in physical form. Ink still warm. The sheets lay flat across the table, their details crisp beneath the morning light. I cross-checked each date, each supporting image, each reference to HOA policy. Then I attached the corresponding documents, sliding them neatly into a labeled envelope. The process felt almost ceremonial, an orderly conclusion to weeks of tracing dissonance back to its source. The house remained steady around me, absorbing the quiet discipline of the moment. I felt my shoulders relax slightly as the report took its final form. Submitting the report required only a few clicks, but I allowed myself to pause before hitting send. Outside the window, a few leaves skittered across the driveway, catching the early breeze. I watched them turn and settle, a faint choreography that mirrored the way loose ends in this situation were slowly finding their place. When I finally pressed the button, the email disappeared into the digital distance with a small shift in screen light. A confirmation message appeared, cold, neutral, almost anticlimactic. But closure often arrives without drama. I exhaled slowly, letting the stillness sink in. The house grew quieter afterward, as if recognizing the weight that had just moved from thought into action. I closed the blinds halfway, allowing filtered light to wash gently across the dining table. I collected the excess papers, clipped them together, and placed them in the folder, now thick enough to rest firmly without sliding. The edges were squared, the sequence complete. I closed it softly, not with finality, but with the acknowledgement that one part of the process had reached its natural stopping point. When I stepped outside for air, the porch was cool beneath my feet, the faint scent of damp wood lifting from the boards. I stood for a moment, letting the breeze move across my face. Nothing dramatic had changed, and yet, everything felt subtly rebalanced. I looked toward the lake, steady and untroubled, and felt a quiet alignment settle within me. I had done what needed to be done, carefully, clearly, without anger. Turning back inside, I felt the space around me take on a calmer rhythm, as if the house itself understood that a necessary threshold had been crossed. The call came just after dusk, when the house had fallen into the gentle, predictable quiet it kept at the end of long days. I was standing by the window, watching the final streaks of light fade across the lake, when my phone buzzed against the counter. Matt's name appeared on the screen, the familiarity of it strangely hollow now. I answered anyway, keeping my tone even. His voice came through strained, layered with forced casualness. "Look," he began, "just give me until the end of summer. One more season and I'll shut it all down. No surprises, no drama." His offer hung in the air like a negotiation in a boardroom, rather than a conversation about a family home. I felt the shift inside me immediately. Not anger, not shock, just a clear line hardening. I walked toward the dining table as he continued speaking. He framed it as compromise, as practicality, as something reasonable people should agree upon. But beneath every word was the assumption that boundaries were flexible if pushed hard enough. The folder lay open on the table, its pages illuminated by the warm overhead light. I glanced at it, at the chronology, the evidence, the choices made. "No," I said, slowly, precisely. "That's not how this works." Silence filled the line for a moment, then a soft, frustrated exhale. "You're being rigid," he muttered. But rigidity wasn't the issue. Principles were. His voice shifted, less confident now, edged with something like desperation. "I didn't mean for it to get this far," he said. "It's just money. I'm trying to catch up." I let the words settle, hearing the honesty mixed with deflection. Struggle could explain poor decisions, but it couldn't absolve them. Not when the choices were deliberate, repeated, concealed. "If you needed help," I said quietly, "there were other ways to ask." He didn't respond. The silence on his end had weight to it, as if he were standing in a room suddenly too small. I waited, steady and patient, giving him space to confront the truth he'd been avoiding. Finally, he spoke again, softer, quieter. "Just a few more months, that's all I'm asking." His tone almost carried sincerity, but sincerity couldn't rewrite what had already happened. I studied the grain of the wooden table beneath my fingertips, letting the calm settle through my body. "The rules don't pause for convenience," I replied. My voice wasn't cold, just certain. His breath caught slightly, a tiny sound that revealed more than his words ever could. He had expected negotiation, maybe even guilt, but clarity was what he found instead. The line stayed open for a long moment. In the background I could hear something faint, perhaps the whir of an appliance or the echo of a space he didn't quite feel comfortable in. "I thought you'd understand," he said finally, barely above a whisper. There was something genuine in that, though misdirected. Understanding didn't mean accepting. I stepped toward the window, watching the porch light glow against the darkened boards. "I do understand," I said, "and that's exactly why this has to stop." There was no triumph in my voice, just steadiness. The conversation ended without resolution, only quiet breathing on both ends before the call disconnected. I set the phone down and closed the folder, the clasp meeting with a firm, muted click. The house settled around me, still, composed, aware. I stood there for a moment, resting my hand on the back of a chair, letting the silence deepen into something grounding. Outside, the porch remained steady under the night sky. Inside, the decision was already made. This wasn't about winning or punishing. It was about alignment, keeping the house and myself within the boundaries that had been tested too many times. The night held its calm, and I matched it. The HOA board met on a Thursday evening, the kind of early dusk where the sky turns a muted blue before giving in completely to night. I arrived a few minutes ahead of schedule, the folder tucked under my arm, its weight familiar now. The meeting room was modest, long table, stackable chairs, a bulletin board filled with neatly penned announcements. A soft hum from the overhead lights filled the space. I took a seat near the end of the table and laid out my documents in clean, parallel lines. As board members filtered in, offering polite nods, I could sense the quiet shift in the room. This wasn't just a discussion anymore, it was review. Formal, structured, necessary. When the meeting began, I walked them through the timeline, without embellishment. I presented the inflated utility bills, the guest encounters, the screenshots, the lock logs, the cancellations, the mediation transcripts. I didn't raise my voice or soften my tone. Each detail was stated plainly, the way someone might recount a sequence of weather patterns or inventory lists. Facts didn't require performance. They required precision. I could feel the table absorb the weight of each documented moment. One member leaned forward, arms crossed, studying the papers intently. Another tapped her pen lightly, processing each step. After I finished, the board asked questions, measured, specific, aimed at clarity rather than challenge. When did you first notice the irregularities? How many guests attempted entry? Were there cash transactions? I answered each one steadily, grounding my responses in the timeline I'd so carefully compiled. The structure of the conversation steadied me further. There was no room for speculation here, only verification. The room remained quiet,
except for the turning of pages and the occasional soft exhale. It felt not adversarial, but methodical, like a group of people aligning themselves with what the evidence demanded.
Midway through the discussion, one board member asked the question that shifted the tone. "What outcome are you seeking?" The room paused. I folded my hands together, allowing myself a breath before responding. "Transparency," I said, "and compliance with the regulations we all agreed to." The simplicity of the statement seemed to settle something across the table. I wasn't requesting punishment. I wasn't motivated by grievance. I wanted the rules upheld because the rules were what protected the integrity of homes like this. Homes that held history, trust, and the quiet rhythms of family memory. The board members nodded almost collectively. The conversation continued, but differently now. Less transactional, more aligned. They examined the evidence again, verifying details against their own records. A few exchanged quiet glances that suggested this wasn't the first time they'd suspected something was amiss. The air in the room grew still, the kind of stillness that comes when a conclusion has begun to form, even if no one speaks it yet. I sat there calmly, listening, the edges of the folder cool beneath my fingertips. In that moment, I felt not tension, but a contained clarity spreading through me, settling into my posture, my breath. When the review concluded, a member at the far end of the table pushed her chair back slightly and spoke. "We'll proceed with enforcement," she said. The words weren't dramatic, just measured and final. I gathered my documents, aligning them carefully before slipping them back into the folder. As I stood, I felt the air shift, lighter, quieter, as if the room itself exhaled. Outside, the evening was cool, the parking lot lit by a handful of steady street lamps. I walked to my car without hurry, the decision echoing in the calm rhythm of my steps. What needed to be acknowledged had been acknowledged. The process had begun its own momentum. The hearing took place in a small municipal building on the edge of town, the kind of structure that looked like it had been designed for efficiency, not comfort. The walls were beige, the chairs functional, the lighting bright enough to flatten every shadow. I arrived early, folder in hand, and took a seat near the long table reserved for statements. The room smelled faintly of paper and old carpet. As I waited, I traced the grain of the table with my fingertips, letting its steadiness quiet the low hum of anticipation. When the door finally opened and Matt stepped inside, he avoided my eyes. He sat across from me, shoulders slightly hunched, as if trying to shrink the space he took up. The air settled heavy between us. When the proceedings began, the committee members arranged their notes with the deliberate rhythm of people accustomed to structured decision-making. One of them pressed the button on the recorder. A small red light flickered on. Matt cleared his throat and spoke first. "I just wanted to keep the house," he said, voice uncharacteristically subdued. "I wasn't trying to cause problems." His words floated across the table, soft, unsteady, almost fragile. I watched him closely, noting the tremor in his hands, the way he clasped them together as if bracing for impact. When it was my turn to respond, I kept my tone measured. "Keeping the house doesn't require deception," I said. "This isn't about mistakes. It's about choices, repeated ones." My voice carried evenly through the room, grounded not in emotion, but in the steady accumulation of facts. Matt looked down, the muscles in his jaw tightening. A quiet rustle of paper passed through the room as one committee member reviewed the timeline. He nodded once, acknowledging the consistency of the evidence. I remained still, hands resting lightly on the folder, prepared, but not confrontational. The committee began asking questions, direct, procedural, thorough. "Were you aware of the regulations? Did you continue renting after the notice?" Matt's responses grew shorter, the space between each answer stretching. I watched the tension gather across his shoulders, his gaze fixed on the table as he spoke. The recorder captured every syllable, its soft mechanical hum filling the room with an unspoken reminder. This wasn't a debate, it was documentation. When the committee questioned the cash payments and the online listing, Matt shifted in his chair, unable to redirect the narrative as he had among friends. At one point I noticed a faint sheen on his forehead, the kind that comes from realizing a situation has slipped fully out of one's control. Still, I felt no triumph, only clarity. I remained composed, answering each follow-up question succinctly. My palms were cool against the cover of the folder, though I could feel a slight dampness beginning at the edges, residual tension working its way out of my body. Outside, through the high windows I could see a pale slice of morning sky brushing against the branches of a bare tree. The world continued its steady rhythm, indifferent to the weight of the moment inside. Eventually the questions ceased, replaced by notes being written, pages turned, pens tapping lightly against clipboards. The room felt quieter now, lighter, as if a pressure valve had been released. The lead committee member closed her binder and announced that deliberations would begin shortly. Matt exhaled audibly, a sound equal parts resignation and fatigue. I stood, closing my folder with a soft, deliberate motion. The chair legs scraped gently against the floor as I pushed them back. Without looking at him, I walked toward the exit, the muted echoes of the room following behind me. The morning air outside was cool and bright, grounding me instantly. I inhaled deeply, letting the sharpness clear whatever remained unspoken. The decision arrived the next morning as an email stamped with a digital seal. Quiet, official, unavoidable. I opened it at the dining table, the house still wrapped in early light. The words were concise. Violation confirmed, fine imposed, enforcement to proceed. No flourish, no apology, no ambiguity. I read the document slowly, letting the clarity settle one line at a time. The committee had reviewed the evidence, cross-checked the dates, verified the logs. Everything aligned. I exhaled a breath I hadn't realized was tight in my chest. The room around me seemed to steady, the silence shifting from tense to grounded. This wasn't victory, it wasn't even relief. It was simply acknowledgement. Truth, once sorted and named, had a different kind of weight. Later, I heard Matt's car pull into the driveway. I stayed at the window, out of sight, watching the way he sat in the driver's seat for a long moment before stepping out. His shoulders slumped slightly, as though the news had pressed directly into his spine. When he reached the porch, he held the printed notice in his hand, the edges already bent from his grip. He glanced toward the front door, not knocking, not calling, just standing with the weight of consequence in his posture. The house remained still around me, offering no commentary. I didn't open the door. Some moments were meant to be faced alone. When he finally spoke, his voice carried faintly through the window pane. "You won," he said, not loudly but with a hollow softness, as if the words held more exhaustion than accusation. The phrase drifted into the quiet yard, settling between us like fog. I stepped closer to the window but didn't move into view. "No," I murmured to myself, the truth landing steadily. This wasn't about winning, it never had been. It was about boundaries. Ones he crossed, ones I enforced, ones the house needed in order to breathe again. His interpretation didn't change the reality. Some losses are simply the delayed result of earlier choices. He stayed on the porch another minute, shifting his weight, glancing at the notice as though hoping it would reinterpret itself. The fine, the enforcement steps, the formal language, everything was clearer than his voice had been in weeks. When he turned back toward his car, his movements were slower, almost careful. I watched him drive away, dust kicking up from the gravel, dissolving as quickly as it formed. The porch remained quiet, the boards undisturbed. I pressed my fingertips lightly against the window frame, steadying my breath. There was no satisfaction in seeing him leave, just the quiet certainty that a necessary line had been drawn. Inside, I walked to the table and opened the folder again. I added a printed copy of the findings, sliding it into the final tab. The paper's crisp texture felt like the conclusion of a long, unspooling thread. My hands moved calmly, without hesitation. The house felt different now, less watchful, more at ease. I thought of my sister, her quiet discipline, her instinct for keeping small things aligned before they grew unmanageable. A soft ache rose in my chest, not painful, just present. I closed the folder gently, letting the clasp settle with a muted click. The sound echoed faintly across the room. As I stood there, the front door's shadow stretched across the floorboards, long and angled from the late morning sun. The house held its silence, not charged, not burdened, simply clear. I touched the back of a chair, grounding myself in the moment, feeling the steadiness replace the earlier strain. The process was not over yet, but something essential had resolved. The truth had been named, recorded, affirmed. I stepped toward the window and let the sunlight warm my face, the quiet steadying me from the inside out. Whatever came next, I felt ready. The formal invoice arrived the next day. A white envelope slipped cleanly into the mailbox, its weight firmer than the usual neighborhood mailers. I carried it inside and opened it at the kitchen counter. The numbers were printed in bold. The $25,000 fine, administrative fees, processing costs. Clear, itemized, unmistakable. I read it twice, not because I needed to, but because the clarity deserved recognition. This wasn't abstract anymore. It wasn't a possibility or a warning. It was a quantified consequence, the kind that leaves no room for interpretation. I placed the paper on the table, smoothing its corners, letting the weight of it settle into the quiet room. The house remained steady, no creaks, no shifting shadows. Just a calm acknowledgement of what had finally taken shape. Later in the afternoon, Matt texted, "This is insane, I can't pay this." A few moments later, another message followed, "Can we talk?" I didn't respond, instead I looked out the window as his car approached the driveway again. He stepped out briskly, pacing near the porch as if movement alone might lighten the burden he carried in his pocket. When he saw me through the window, he lifted the invoice slightly, shaking it with a mixture of frustration and plea. His expression carried a desperation I hadn't seen before, raw, unguarded, untidy. But even that didn't alter the truth. The numbers were not personal, they were procedural. I opened the front door but stood inside, creating a quiet boundary. "They sent this to me," he said, voice thinner than before. "Do you see what they're asking?" I nodded. "Yes," I said calmly. "And every line is tied to a choice you made." His shoulders dropped, the defensiveness draining from him. For a moment he looked younger, almost lost. "I didn't think it would go this far," he whispered. I believed that. People rarely anticipate consequences until they're itemized in black and white. But understanding didn't erase the fact that he had moved through each boundary believing it would bend for him. He sat on the porch step, elbows on his knees, invoice dangling from his hand. "I don't know how to start fixing this," he said. The honesty in his voice was new, unpolished, unfiltered. I stepped outside, leaning against the railing. "You start by acknowledging the truth," I said, not unkindly. "You weren't protecting the house. You were using it." He didn't argue. He simply stared at the gravel, tracing lines with the toe of his shoe. The afternoon sun cast long shadows behind him, stretching across the worn boards of the porch, as if marking the quiet distance between intention and impact. Inside, after he left, I returned to the table and opened my notebook, writing a single line. Responsibility always arrives, sometimes late, but always exact. It wasn't judgment, it was observation. The fine was steep, but it reflected the accumulation of small, repeated choices. I closed the notebook and glanced at the invoice lying under the soft pool of sunlight. The numbers didn't feel harsh. They felt accurate. A measured response to an unmeasured series of actions. I placed it inside the folder, aligning it with the other documents, letting its presence complete the narrative arc the evidence had been building. The late afternoon light filtered gently through the blinds, casting stripes across the table, the folder, the polished surface of the invoice beneath it. I stood there for a moment, watching how the brightness softened as the sun lowered. The house breathed in its quiet rhythm, no longer tense, no longer unsettled, just steady. I rested my palm lightly on the folder, feeling its accumulated weight. It didn't burden me, it centered me. Outside, the driveway was empty again, the quiet restored. The numbers had spoken, and in their precision, I felt a sense of balance settle in. A final turning of a wheel that had been grinding for far too long. The enforcement notice came through as a formal PDF, stamped with the HOA seal and a signature block lined in sharp digital ink. I opened it at the dining table, the same place where every step of this process had taken shape. The words were clear. Remove the unauthorized lock code. Disable all rental access. Submit proof of compliance within a specified window, and settle the outstanding fine. There was no room for interpretation. I printed the document and set it beside the others, the paper still warm from the machine. As I read it again, I felt a subtle shift. Less tension, more direction. The house seemed to breathe evenly, its walls quiet, its floors settling into a calmer rhythm. Enforcement wasn't punishment, it was alignment. A return to what should have been maintained all along. I changed the door code first. The keypad clicked softly beneath my fingers as I entered the new sequence, each button lighting up with a muted glow. When the lock confirmed with a firm mechanical snap, I stepped back and let the sound settle into the porch boards. Inside, I printed a screenshot of the updated access log and attached it to the folder. My handwriting on the note beside it was clean and simple. Code updated. Unauthorized access disabled. There was something steadying about the process. Precise, procedural, unhurried. I photographed the door, the new label, the timestamp on my phone. Each step documented, each detail accounted for. There was still the matter of notifying Matt. I prepared a certified letter containing the enforcement summary, the payment instructions, and the compliance evidence he would need to review. I wrote the address carefully, sealing the envelope with a slow press of my thumb across the adhesive strip. Before placing it in the outgoing mail tray, I paused, letting the weight of the envelope rest in my hand. It wasn't vindictive. It wasn't a message. It was a boundary made tangible. Paper, ink, and the quiet firmness of consequence. I set it down gently, recognizing the finality it carried. As I stepped outside to mail the letter, the air held a faint chill, clean, soft, the kind that brushes against your face without lingering. The mailbox stood steady at the end of the walkway. I lifted the red flag and slid the envelope inside. The motion felt small, almost ceremonial. A thin line of sunlight stretched across the driveway, highlighting the subtle dust patterns left by tires, no longer coming and going. I let my gaze settle there for a moment, absorbing the quiet clarity of the scene. The porch behind me held its calm, no longer a revolving door of strangers. Back inside, the house felt different, lighter, almost relieved. I walked through each room slowly, as if reacquainting myself with a space that had finally returned to itself.
The living room carried only the scent of my own presence now, none of the lingering traces of unfamiliar detergent. The kitchen counters were clear, the floors steady beneath my steps. I felt a small release in my shoulders, the kind that arrives when the work shifts from reactive to resolved. I documented the final compliance steps in my notebook, closing it with a sense of clean completion. At the end of the day, I stood in the hallway and looked toward the front door, its new code locked, its threshold quiet. The house exhaled around me, as if reclaiming its shape after months of strain. I rested my hand against the doorframe, feeling the cool grain of the wood beneath my palm. Enforcement wasn't harsh, it was necessary. A gentler kind of correction. The fine, the documentation, the steps taken, they all formed a balanced response to imbalance. As the evening settled, I allowed myself one long, steady breath. The process had not ended, but the direction was clear, and for the first time in a long while, the house felt unmistakably protected. I spent the morning organizing the final documents the HOA requested: photos, updated logs, confirmation receipts. Once everything was saved and filed, I moved to the front door with a small toolkit and the new access instructions printed neatly on a single sheet. Changing the outer code was one part of compliance. Posting the transparent access schedule was another. I taped the laminated schedule inside the entryway, aligning its corners with deliberate care.
The house looked different in this new clarity. Nothing hidden, nothing implied. I stepped back and studied the door, the new keypad light blinking in a steady rhythm. The space felt cleaner, less burdened, as if the walls were settling into a rhythm they hadn't been allowed in months. The house wasn't just secured, it was grounded. Outside, the wind moved through the pines with a soft rustling sound. I knelt by the planter beside the porch steps, brushing away a thin layer of soil to reveal the small hollow where my sister once kept a spare key. I placed a single key there now, a gesture not of invitation, but of closure. A way of acknowledging the past without reopening it. The key was old, from the original lock, more symbolic than functional. I covered it lightly with soil and stood, brushing my hands against my jeans. I felt her presence then. Not in a dramatic way, but in a quiet alignment, like a room falling back into its natural order. I snapped a photo of the porch, the door, and the secured entryway, then emailed the images to the HOA with the message, "All measures completed." The words were simple, but they held a sense of clean finality. I watched the email send, the small whoosh of the outgoing message sounding almost like an exhale. When I turned back toward the living room, sunlight spilled in through the high windows, touching the floor in warm, unbroken patterns. Evidence of peace, not victory. I let the light stretch across my shoes before stepping fully inside, feeling its quiet warmth ground me. For the first time since returning to the lake house, I felt no undercurrent of tension in the air. The walls didn't hum with intrusion. The wood floors didn't echo with the weight of someone else's footsteps. I walked through each room slowly, not inspecting this time but reacquainting myself. The living room felt open and familiar, the kitchen steady and honest, the hallway free of that faint, unwelcome fragrance that once lingered. I paused at the threshold of my sister's old reading nook, the cushion still slightly indented in the pattern she favored. Her absence felt less like a wound and more like a quiet imprint now, something that remained without demanding anything of me. When I returned to the front of the house, I opened the door and let the afternoon air drift inside. The porch light flicked on in response to a passing cloud, the warm glow stretching into the entryway. It cast a soft, golden reflection across the wooden floor, a steady beam, not flickering, not hesitant. I leaned against the doorframe, absorbing the stillness. I realized then that I no longer felt like a guest in this space. The house felt like mine again, not through possession but through stewardship, through the quiet work of restoration, not force. I closed the door gently, the latch catching with a clean, satisfying click. A faint scent of dry wood and the tea my sister favored lingered in the air, subtle and comforting.
I exhaled slowly, allowing the moment to settle into me. This was not triumph, it was return. A recovery of boundaries, of clarity, of the way things were meant to function. I walked toward the kitchen to make tea, feeling the soft grain of the floor beneath each step. Tomorrow would bring the final stage, but tonight, the house finally felt aligned, balanced, entirely itself again. The morning arrived soft and pale, the kind of light that takes its time settling over the lake and the sloping porch boards. I carried the folder, now thinner, its contents organized and complete, into the small room off the hallway where the safe was kept. The metal box sat quietly on its shelf, unremarkable but reliable. I placed the folder inside, smoothing my hand along its cover once before closing the door. The latch clicked into place with a clean, definitive sound. It no longer felt like a record of conflict, but a record of clarity, a witness to the line between responsibility and avoidance. As I stood there, the quiet in the room felt even, almost measured, like the space itself recognized the closing of a long chapter. When I stepped back into the living room, the porch light caught my eye through the window, steady, warm, unblinking. Its constancy was comforting, in a way I hadn't expected. So much of the past weeks had been defined by flickers of doubt, of intrusion, of uncertainty. Now, the steady glow felt like an answer. I walked to the window and rested my fingertips against the cool glass. Outside, the yard was still, the air calm. Nothing pressing against the edges of my attention. For the first time since all this began, the house didn't feel watchful. It felt at ease. I moved through the rooms with an unhurried pace, letting my steps echo gently against the wood floors. The kitchen carried only the faint scent of tea leaves, the counters clean and unmarred. The living room breathed in a slow rhythm, the furniture settled, the silence soft rather than strained. In each room I felt a small recalibration, like a house adjusting to its rightful proportions. This wasn't about returning to what had been lost. It was about finding a new equilibrium, one grounded not in nostalgia, but in honesty. I touched the back of the couch where my sister once read for hours, feeling her presence not as grief but as guidance. I paused at the doorway and looked back toward the porch. Sunlight had begun to stretch across the entryway, catching dust motes in the air like suspended notes of quiet. Her words, ones she once said half-jokingly during a minor disagreement, rose in my memory with unexpected clarity. Hold the line on what's right, even if someone else laughs about it. At the time, I thought she meant small things, chores, routines, tasks that kept our lives orderly. Now I understood the deeper truth in her tone. Doing what's right wasn't about force. It was about steadiness, about choosing alignment over approval. I returned to the kitchen, filled the kettle, and waited for the soft boil. The steam curled upward in a slow drift, catching the morning light in fleeting silver threads. The silence around me wasn't empty. It was full, layered with the afterglow of resolution. I poured the water over the tea leaves and watched them unfurl in gentle spirals. Balance, I realized, rarely announced itself loudly. It arrived in the settling of breath, in the absence of tension, in the way a house felt when it no longer carried someone else's weight. I carried the cup to the table and sat quietly, letting the warmth move through me. When I opened the front door, the late morning air met me with a calm I hadn't felt in months. The porch was warm beneath the sun, the light stretching across the boards in clean, uninterrupted lines. I stood there, absorbing the simplicity of the moment. This wasn't triumph. It wasn't victory. It was restoration. An internal and external balance aligning at the same quiet pace. As I stepped outside, I whispered a small acknowledgement to the house, to my sister, to the journey. Fairness isn't revenge. It's balance. And balance, once found, carries its own gentle strength. In the end, nothing about this journey felt triumphant. There was no dramatic victory, no raised voice, no slammed door. Just the slow settling of truth into its rightful place. The fines were issued, the access codes changed, the house restored to the quiet dignity my sister always imagined for it. And somewhere in the middle of all that, between the hearings and the long silences,
something inside me realigned too. I used to think protecting a home meant guarding the walls, fixing the small things, keeping the lights working. But it turns out protection is quieter than that. It's choosing boundaries over conflict, clarity over chaos, honesty over comfort. It's standing steady even when someone hopes you'll bend. Now when I walk through the lake house, I feel its balance again. The calm floors, the clean air, the stillness that doesn't ask for anything. Maybe that's what healing really looks like. A place returning to itself, and a person doing the same. If this story resonated with you, if you've ever had to reclaim something that mattered, leave a comment below. I'd love to hear your experience. And if you want more stories told with this same quiet, honest intensity, don't forget to subscribe to the channel.